The Ossuary Bloom, Chapter 8, The Great Stillness. The air in Sector Command was the scent of chilled, filtered nothingness. Vespera Lyrian preferred it that way. It was the antithesis of the station's ambient perfume, the cloying sweetness of hydroponic decay, the metallic tang of recycled water, the ever-present low-level ozone that spoke of failing systems. Here, in the heart of the architect's monitoring hub, the air was a statement of control. It was pure, sterile, and silent but for the subliminal hum of server stacks and the whisper of hyper-efficient ventilation. Her station was an alcove of obsidian glass and brushed, faded gold trim, an island of focus in the cavernous, dimly lit hub. Lines of sapphire blue data streamed across the wraparound holographic display, each one a tributary feeding the great river of Aethelgard's operational status. Vespera's fingers moved with economical grace over the touch-sensitive surface, her gestures precise, her focus absolute. She was finalizing the incident report, a necessary, almost sacred ritual of restoring order. Incident log RES-S77B. Ossuary Level 4. Cryo-Bay, Cigna. Classification: System Anomaly. The words glowed with institutional finality, the official narrative already hardening into fact. Her mind replayed the event with detached clarity, the localized energy surge, the cascade failure in the cryopod network, the resulting electromagnetic phenomenon that witnesses, in their ignorance and fear, had labeled resonance. A ghost, a voice from the dead. Such were the fanciful, chaotic interpretations of the untrained mind. Vespera saw only a system glitch, a spike of noise in the sacred silence, and her job was to document its suppression. She cross-referenced the telemetry from the suppression team's arrival, timestamps aligned perfectly, biosignatures of the witnesses, a disgraced xenobiologist named Thorne, and a handful of ossuary custodians were recorded, their elevated heart rates and cortisol levels a testament to the disruption. A primitive, emotional response to a simple hardware failure. She traced the subsequent data stream, the one labeled Harmonization Protocol. The logs were clean. The witnesses had been pacified, their recent agitated memories of the event smoothed over, replaced with the calming, mundane recollection of a standard maintenance cycle. The Great Stillness restored.
It was a beautiful process in its way. A kind of psychic surgery. The architects didn't erase identity, as the dregs whispered in the rust gardens. They simply pruned it. They curated it. They removed the thorny branches of trauma and fear that could choke the soul and threaten the stability of the whole. They ensured the garden of the mind remained orderly. Vespera felt a quiet, profound satisfaction in being an instrument of that order. It was a faith measured in clean data and placid brainwaves. She swiped to the final section of the report. Post-operation inventory manifest. A formality. The system ran an automated check against the loadouts of the suppression team, ensuring all equipment was returned and accounted for. A cascade of green check marks filled the display, each one a tiny affirmation of completeness. Team lead gear, manifest, confirmed. Medkit consumables, confirmed. Neural harmonizer power cells, confirmed. It was perfect. Almost. A single icon nestled at the bottom of the list for a suppression unit gamma glowed a soft, insistent amber. It wasn't red, not an alert, just an annotation, a discrepancy. It was a tiny, jarring note of imperfection in an otherwise flawless composition. Vespera's placid focus sharpened to a fine point. Her finger hovered over the icon for a beat before tapping it. A sub-window expanded. Inventory Discrepancy Log, G7, Asset ID, DCK79001B. Type, Encrypted Data Chip, Standard. Status, Unaccounted for. Post-operation notes, Automated flag, Asset not detected in kit upon return to Armory. A data chip. One single standard-issue chip from a tech's field kit. It was nothing. A piece of hardware no larger than her thumbnail. Its contents triple encrypted and likely holding nothing more than diagnostic subroutines. Insignificant. The tech, a man named Corvin, probably dropped it when he was packing up. It would be swept up by a maintenance drone and incinerated within the cycle.
But Vespera was not 99 out of 100 technicians. Her entire life, her entire belief system, was built on the principle that there was no such thing as insignificant chaos. The Great Stillness was an absolute state. A single discordant vibration, however faint, was still a violation. A loose thread, however small, could eventually unravel the entire tapestry. Her mind, a machine built for pattern recognition and logical progression, began to cycle through possibilities. Accidental loss, probability 98.7%. Equipment malfunction, false flag from the Armory scanner, probability 1.2%. Intentional removal, probability 0.1%. Who would steal a useless encrypted data chip, and for what purpose? It made no sense. And yet, it was an integer out of place, a variable without a defined value, an untidy loose end. The calm professionalism she cultivated so carefully was still present on the surface, her expression unchanged, her posture perfect. But underneath, a flicker of something else had ignited. It wasn't fear, it was analytical unease. The cold, sharp prickle of an intellectual problem that resisted immediate solution. The feeling of a perfectly balanced equation being thrown off by a single misplaced decimal point. She could feel the hum of the servers around her, the sound that was usually a comforting mantra of order. Now it seemed to have a questioning tone. The sterile air felt a fraction less pure. She wouldn't override the flag. That would be a lie, a tiny corruption introduced into the system by her own hand. It would be a concession to entropy. Instead, she followed protocol. Her fingers moved again, this time with a new, deliberate intensity. She created a new file, a low-priority follow-up ticket. The action felt both minor and momentous. Ticket ID LP8814G. Subject: Asset Discrepancy. Incident RE77B. Action: Cross-reference Ossuary Level 4 security logs, timecode 2240 to 2310. Isolate suppression unit gamma exit path. Tag all personnel interactions. Linked to personnel file Corvin, J, Tech Grade 3. She didn't escalate it. That would be an overreaction, a surrender to the very emotionalism she sought to quell in others. This was a measured response, a quiet inquiry, a simple tightening of a loose thread. She linked the ticket to her primary report, and the amber icon on the manifest turned a placid blue, indicating an active but non-critical follow-up. The report was now, technically, complete.
Vesper leaned back in her chair, the motion minute. Her screen was once again a sea of cool, orderly blue, but she didn't feel the usual sense of closure. Her gaze remained fixed on the file number for ticket LP8814G. It floated in the corner of her vision, a tiny string of alphanumeric code that represented a question mark, an imperfection, a single dark speck on a canvas of pristine white, and in the perfect, silent world Vespera Lyrian had dedicated her life to maintaining, it was the only thing she could see.
"Come on, you piece of—" he muttered, his voice a gravelly whisper swallowed by the hum of the machinery. He ran a diagnostic he'd written himself, a brute force ice pick designed to pry open standard corporate security. The lines of code scrolled, a frantic green waterfall against the black, then stuttered, froze. A single elegant icon bloomed in the center of the screen, a stylized silent bell, the mark of the architects of silence. It didn't just block his entry, it mocked him. It was a digital sneer. He leaned back, the scavenged chair groaning in protest. His rig was a Frankenstein's monster of salvaged parts, a processing core from a defunct cargo hauler, memory banks from a medbay diagnostic unit, a cooling system jury-rigged from a nutrient chiller. It was a testament to his ingenuity, a machine built from the station's bones. Against this chip, it was a child throwing pebbles at a fortress wall. He could feel the encryption. It wasn't a static lock, it was alive, a dormant intelligence that tasted his intrusion and dismissed it without effort. The initial thrill of the score, that hot spike of cynical satisfaction, was curdling into the cold, familiar acid of impotence. This chip was his ticket. His way out of the rust gardens, out from under the perpetual damp and the low-level radiation that had gnawed away at the health of everyone he'd ever known. He could trade this for enough echoes to buy passage on a void-borne freighter, find a new rock to die on, one that at least had a real sun. Or he could sell it on the black market and live like an architect for a year, fat and safe, in some quiet corner of the Viridia Spire, before the rot of this place claimed him anyway. The potential was a dizzying weight in his pocket, but a locked box of gold is just a heavy rock. He picked up the chip, turning it over between his calloused thumb and forefinger. It was unnervingly smooth, unnaturally cold. It felt like holding a secret that belonged to the silent masters of Aethelgard, the very people who curated the station's slow death, the people who let the reactors in the lower levels leak, who doused the air with pacifying agents, who maintained the Great Stillness by any means necessary. He'd seen them work in the Ossuary, the brutal, efficient erasure of the resonance event. They weren't just janitors cleaning up a glitch. They were exorcists. And this chip, this was a page torn from their Bible. His mind snagged on a memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass in the gut. Another small, useless thing he couldn't open. A locket. His daughter's. He'd found it in her cot, after the sickness from the irradiated water had taken her. He tried to pry it open, his big, clumsy fingers fumbling with the tiny clasp until he'd broken it. He never saw what was inside. He had just held the broken prize in his hand, a perfect metaphor for his entire life, a monument to his own failure. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, pushing the image away. This was different. This wasn't sentiment. This was currency. This was power. And it demanded a key he did not possess. The thought slithered into his mind, unwelcome and oily. Help. He needed help. His entire body recoiled from the word. Trust was a currency for the rich and the stupid. In the Rust Gardens, it was a liability, a weakness to be exploited. You share your score, you get a knife in the back. You share your weakness, you get a boot on your neck. The faces of a dozen dead scavengers flashed through his mind, all of them guilty of the same sin, believing someone else had their best interests at heart. Yet the chip remained inert, a silent black void of potential. To let it sit here, to eventually trade it for a handful of rations when desperation finally clawed deep enough, felt like a deeper failure than any betrayal. It would be a surrender, a quiet admission that he was, and always would be, just a rat in the walls, feeding on scraps.
He stood up, pacing the 3 steps his cramped workshop allowed, back and forth. The dripping continued its steady torture. Drip, drip, drip. Who could he even approach? The black market data slicers were all gossips and informants, more interested in selling you out to the architects for a loyalty bonus than in honoring a deal. The technocrats in the spire wouldn't give a dreg the time of day, let alone help him crack a stolen piece of their master's tech. Then a name surfaced, not from the usual channels of smugglers and data thieves, but from the more chaotic eddies of station gossip. Whispers from a low-level tech he'd traded a power converter to, a name associated with the recent trouble in the Ossuary levels. Dr. Aris Thorne. The disgraced. The echo-lost. A xenobiologist who'd lost his wife, his reputation, everything. A man whose obsession had led to ruin. Now he was apparently sniffing around the resonance phenomenon, asking questions he shouldn't. An architect in exile of a sort. A specialist in the very neural mapping tech that the high-tier station hardware was built on. He would have the knowledge. He would have the skills. More importantly, he was compromised. A man with a ghost. A man like that was desperate. And desperate men take risks. Hroldar understood desperation. It was the air he breathed. But Thorne's was a different flavor. It wasn't for survival. It was for something more dangerous. Redemption, maybe. Or answers. People seeking answers were predictable. They had a singular focus. You could aim them. The risk was still astronomical. Thorne could be an architect plant. He could be insane. He could take one look at the chip and turn Hroldar in. But the logic was cold and sharp. The chip was worthless without an expert. The only experts he couldn't buy were the ones he couldn't trust. The only expert he might be able to use was one who needed the chip as much as he did. Thorne wasn't just a key. He was another locked box. Maybe, just maybe, they had keys to each other's problems. Hroldar stopped his pacing. The cynical satisfaction he'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by the grim, cold weight of a decision. He looked at his reflection in the dark screen of the monitor, a gaunt, tired face carved from suspicion. He was about to break the first and most important rule of his long, bitter life.
He was going to find Dr. Thorne. He was going to offer a trade. He was going to trust him. Ugh. A low, guttural sound of disgust and resignation escaped his lips. He carefully picked up the architect chip, wrapped it in a static-proof cloth, and tucked it into a hidden pocket inside his worn jacket. The little piece of tech felt impossibly heavy, like the first stone of an avalanche he was about to start. The descent was a transition between worlds. Eris Thorne stepped from the sterile, ozone-scoured environment of the Viridia Spire's transit hub into the rust gardens, and the air itself became an assault. It was thick, wet, and heavy in his lungs, a foul symphony of decay. The prim undertones of formaldehyde and recycled water he was accustomed to were suffocated here by the primal stench of rotting vegetation and hot, corrosive metal. His lab coat, a symbol of authority and intellect in his own level, felt like a fool's costume, a pristine white target against the backdrop of rust and grime. He clutched the railing of the gangway, his knuckles white. Below him, the market was a sprawling, chaotic organism. Corroded walkways crisscrossed over vast, steaming hydroponic vats. The dominant grays and faded golds of the upper station were replaced here with the angry reds of oxidation and the sickly greens of algae and bioluminescent fungi. These patches of ethereal light pulsed on damp walls, casting long, dancing shadows that made the press of bodies below seem like a convocation of ghosts. The constant rhythmic drip of condensation was the station's weeping, a sound that drilled into his skull. Every step he took on the grated metal platform felt precarious. The hum of failing life support was louder here, punctuated by the shriek of grinding gears and the distant percussive clang of a rogue maintenance drone colliding with a support strut. This was not the dignified decay of the Gothic spires. This was a festering wound, and he was deliberately walking into it. He scanned the crowd, dregs, technicians who had fallen from grace. Faces were gaunt, etched with a hardness Eris had only ever observed through sanitized security feeds. They moved with the predatory economy of motion, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing. He felt their gazes on him, 100 points of cold evaluation. They saw his clean clothes, his soft hands, the nervous tension in his shoulders. They saw an outsider.
He was looking for a scavenger, a man named Haraldar Brecker. The anonymous message had been simple, a single encrypted line giving a location and a time. The Weeping Arch, half bell past nadir. Aris checked the chronometer on his wrist. He was on time. The arch, a massive curved pipe, thick with rust-colored stalactites of condensed minerals, was just ahead. It wept a steady stream of murky water into a collection trough below, the source of its name. And standing under it, half shrouded in shadow and steam, was a man. He was leaning against the corroded metal, arms crossed, watching Aris approach with an unnerving stillness. He was built like a support beam, broad and solid, and dressed in patched, utilitarian fatigues that blended perfectly with the surrounding decay. His face was a landscape of grim experience, a scar tracing a pale line from his left eyebrow to his jaw. He didn't look up as Aris drew near. He had been watching him the entire time. This had to be him. The sheer, radiating contempt was signal enough. Aris stopped a few feet away, the space between them charged with a hostile energy. The air was so humid his throat felt sticky. "Haraldar Brecker?" Aris asked, his voice sounding thin and academic in the oppressive air. The man's eyes, the color of chipped slate, finally moved to meet his. He didn't answer. He just looked Aris up and down, a slow, insulting appraisal that took in his pristine coat, his clean-shaven face, his nervous posture. A flicker of something, Amusement, or perhaps just disgust, crossed his features. "You're a long way from your pretty towers, Doctor," the man growled. The voice was like gravel in a turbine. "Get lost?" "I'm here because you have something," Aris said, forcing himself to hold the man's gaze. He felt a tremor in his hand and clenched it into a fist at his side. This had to be a mistake, a desperate, foolish mistake. But the echo of Lyra he'd witnessed in the ossuary, it left him no other choice. "I have lots of things," Heroldar said, pushing himself off the wall. He took a slow step closer, invading Aris's personal space. The man smelled of rust, sweat, and something acridly chemical, the radiation he supposedly lived and worked in. Scrap metal? Questionable fungus? A charming personality? You'll have to be more specific.
Aris swallowed, his academic composure fraying. A data chip from the Ossuary suppression team. Level Gamma 7, 3 cycles ago. Roldar's eyes narrowed. He was a predator who had just heard the squeak of its prey. He let the silence hang, a weapon in itself. The drip, drip, drip from the arch above seemed to count the seconds of Aris's folly. "Echo lost, are we? Thinking I just pick up trinkets dropped by architect thugs?" Roldar's lip curled. "That's a dangerous story to be telling down here, Dr. Thorne." He knew his name. Of course he did. Aris had sent the initial encrypted query. He had exposed himself completely. "I'm not telling a story," Aris insisted, his voice gaining a sliver of his old authority. "I am a xenobiologist. My field is the analysis of anomalous phenomena. The official reports on resonance are incomplete. I have reason to believe that chip contains data that contradicts the official narrative. I need to see it." Roldar let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. It was a dead sound, devoid of humor. "You need to see it? Ha ha! Oh, that's good. The technocrats and their little needs. You think this is a library? You think you can just check out forbidden knowledge? Down here, need is a currency. And you, Doctor, look bankrupt." He gestured vaguely at Aris's coat. "Stillness upon you," he mocked, spitting the formal greeting like a curse. "You architects and your pet scientists, you talk about your great stillness, your tranquility, but you're the ones making all the damn noise, a noise that gets people killed." "I am not an architect," Aris said through gritted teeth. The accusation stung, touching a raw nerve of his own complicated history with Edelgard's elite. He was disgraced, an outcast in his own world, yet here he was being lumped in with his former masters. "Close enough," Roldar grunted. He reached into a pouch on his belt, and for a terrifying second, Aris thought he was pulling a weapon. Instead, he produced a small, grimy data chip, holding it between a thumb and forefinger. It glinted under the eerie fungal glow. "This little piece of memory, it cost me." The suppression team wasn't happy about witnesses. Had to lose them in the reclamation conduits. "Nearly got my leg sheared off." He held it out, then snatched it back as Aris instinctively reached for it.
Heroldar chided, his voice a low growl. "So the question is, Doctor, what is it worth to you? What does a man who has everything but the truth trade for a piece of it?" The confrontation hung in the wet, foul air. Aris's mind, accustomed to complex equations and neural mapping, struggled to process the raw transaction before him. He had nothing this man wanted, no echoes, no black market tech. He had only his obsessive, all-consuming need to understand what was happening in the ossuary, to understand if the ghost of his wife was a key or a curse. "I don't have echoes," Eris admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I know," Hroldar said, a cruel smile touching his lips. "I don't want your money." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping. "I want to know why an architect lapdog is risking his neck for a ghost story. I want to know what you know. And when I know what you know, I'll decide what it's worth." He pressed the cool, grimy chip into Eris's palm, closing his fingers around it with his own rough, calloused hand. "The plan's changed, Doctor," Hroldar said, his voice returning to its normal, contemptuous volume. "This isn't your little research project anymore. You're in the gardens now. And down here, you follow my rules." The air in the maintenance tunnel was thick enough to chew. It was a foul cocktail unique to Aethelgard's lowest guts. The sharp, sterile bite of ozone, overlaid with the wet, metallic decay of rusting iron and something else, something deeper, a hint of the mulchy sweetness from the rust gardens, bleeding through the corroded ductwork. For Eris, accustomed to the filtered, formaldehyde-laced stillness of the ossuary levels, it was a physical assault. Each breath felt heavy, laden with the station's slow, industrial death. Hroldar moved ahead of him with the unnerving confidence of a creature born to the dark. His heavy boots made no sound on the grated metal walkway, a trick of weight distribution Eris couldn't begin to fathom. The scavenger didn't look back, his silence a command to keep pace. The only light came from failing emergency strips that cast the narrow passage in a strobing, sickly yellow, and the ethereal blue-green glow of bioluminescent fungi that clung to weeping pipes like spectral frost. The shadows danced, long and distorted, turning the cramped tunnel into a writhing, living throat. Eris's own footsteps were clumsy, loud. The rubber soles of his standard-issue boots squeaked on damp patches, the sound echoing unnaturally in the oppressive quiet. He kept his hands balled into fists, resisting the urge to steady himself against the sweating, weeping walls. He was a xenobiologist, a man of sterile labs and precise data streams. Here, surrounded by raw, decaying infrastructure, he felt like a specimen himself, pinned under the immense weight of the station above. "He's taking me to my death," the thought surfaced, cold and sharp. "This is a trap. He'll take my echoes, leave my body for the reclamation drones." But the thought lacked conviction. Desperation had its own logic, and right now, this cynical, hard-bitten scavenger was the only key Eris had, the only path forward that might lead to answers, to Lyra. Her name was a silent mantra in the chaos of his mind, the one signal clear enough to cut through the static of his fear. Hroldar finally stopped. He raised a hand, palm flat, without turning. "Here." Eris peered around the man's broad shoulder. Ahead, the tunnel opened slightly into a small nexus of industrial horror, a massive junction box, its panel ripped away long ago, exposed a tangled knot of cables as thick as a man's arm. They were monsters of woven copper and polymer, their insulation cracked and peeling like sunburnt skin. Blue-white sparks spat erratically from a frayed connection, sizzling as they hit a puddle of rust-colored water on the floor below. The air hummed, a deep, resonant B-flat that vibrated in Eris's teeth. It was the raw,
untamed power of the station, laid bare and bleeding into the corridor. "Stillness upon us," Eris whispered, the platitude feeling hollow and absurd in this place of violent energy. "What is this?" "The aorta," Hroldar grunted, shrugging off the heavy canvas pack he carried. It landed with a dull metallic thud. He knelt and began unrolling a toolkit made of stained, repurposed leather. The tools within were grotesque hybrids of salvaged parts, a wrench head welded to a meter-long insulated pole, a pair of pliers with ceramic jaws the size of a fist. "One of several. This one feeds the surveillance and data log systems for this whole sector, including the lower access points to the ossuary." Hroldar let out a short, humorless puff of air that wasn't quite a laugh. "No cutting power is clean. A system failure. The architect's drones would have it rerouted and repaired in minutes, and they'd have a perfect log of the outage. We'd be flagged before we even reach the ossuary doors." He pulled out the long insulated pole and a thick, coiled cable with a heavy magnetic clamp on each end. "We're not cutting it. We're choking it." He gestured with his chin towards the sparking junction. "We're going to give it a seizure, a messy one. A massive, dirty power spike that floods the local grid with so much noise they won't know what's a real alert and what's a phantom echo. It'll create a dozen false positives, system restarts, diagnostic loops, chaos." "A cascade failure," Eris realized. "He's hiding a whisper by screaming. It's brilliant and utterly insane." "The risk?" Eris asked, his voice barely audible over the hum. "The risk," Hroldar said, rising to his feet with the long pole in hand, "is that this old beast doesn't just have a seizure. It has a catastrophic aneurysm, blows the whole conduit, plunges this sector into darkness, and triggers every failsafe from here to the spire." He glanced back at Eris, his eyes glinting in the fungal glow. "Or I slip, and they find a pile of carbonized dust where I was standing. So stay back, and for the love of the void, don't touch the walls." Eris scrambled back, pressing himself against the opposite side of the tunnel, the cold, damp metal seeping through his jumpsuit. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was the precipice, the moment their careful, clandestine plan became a loud, violent act of sabotage. Hroldar took a deep, steadying breath. He attached one of the magnetic clamps to a thick, rusted support beam well away from the junction. He then took the other end of the cable, its clamp held carefully in his gloved hand, and approached the furious, sparking nest of wires. He moved with a grace that was terrifyingly out of place, a bomb disposal expert dancing with a live warhead. He braced the insulated pole against his hip, using its forked ceramic tip to nudge two of the thickest cables, one black and one a faded, angry red, slightly apart. Eris held his breath. The air grew thick with ozone. The sound of the arcing intensified, a high-pitched, frantic crackling.
He's going to short them. He's going to connect the main feed directly to the station's frame. This is suicide. Hroldar's muscles bunched under his worn jacket. He positioned the clamp, his movements slow, deliberate, a surgeon preparing for the first incision. For a heartbeat, everything seemed to stop. The dripping water, the hum of the conduit, Eris's own frantic pulse. There was only Hroldar, a silhouette against a cage of lightning. Then he moved. He didn't just place the clamp, he slammed it home with a sharp, forceful thrust. "Now," he grunted. The world dissolved into pure, violent energy. A deafening crack hum erupted from the junction, a sound that was both heard and felt, a physical blow that shook the entire tunnel. A flash of incandescent white-blue light bleached all color from existence, searing Eris's retinas even through squeezed-shut eyes. The strobing emergency lights overhead flickered violently, then died. The fungal glow on the pipes flared for a second, then vanished as if consumed. Plunging, absolute darkness. The only light was the furious, sputtering afterglow from the junction box, which now spat a shower of orange and green sparks like a dying firework. The deep hum was gone, replaced by a high-pitched, wounded whine. The smell of burnt plastic and vaporized metal flooded the air, acrid and suffocating. Eris's ears rang. Spots danced in his vision. "Roldar?" he choked out, his voice hoarse. A dark shape moved, a metallic scrape. A flare of a chemical matchstick cast Roldar's face in a grim, demonic light. His expression was a mask of intense concentration. "It's done," he growled, his voice tight. "The clock is running. Let's move." In the sterile quiet of her monitoring hub high in the Viridia spire, the alert was not a sound. It was a violation. A piercing digital shriek that cut through the placid hum of the architect's controlled environment. Vespera Lyrian didn't flinch. Her eyes, pale and analytical, were already fixed on the central console. Red glyphs flooded the screen, cascading over the neat columns of blue and green status indicators. Power fluctuation, grid 7, voltage anomaly detected, subroutine corruption. It was a mess, but a familiar one. The station was old. It bled. But then a single line of text appeared, flagged with the highest priority, a designation she had not seen in 3 years.
Manual override event, conduit 7, GAMMA04, catastrophic short circuit detected. Manual. Not a failure, an act. Vespera's fingers flew across the holographic interface, her expression hardening from dispassionate observation to cold, focused purpose. She bypassed the corrupted diagnostic reports, pulling raw sensor data from the moments just before the surge. There, 2 distinct biosignatures, unregistered, moving with purpose in a restricted maintenance corridor. They were not lost dregs. This was intentional. She leaned forward, the red light of the alert reflecting in her unblinking eyes. "Lockdown Sector Gamma," she said, her voice calm and clear, transmitted to the station's security network. "Seal all access to Ossuary levels 9 through 12. I want them found."